Hey, everybody. My apologies for having to miss class yesterday. So, this will be a makeup video. We're going to begin to talk about the transition from production to post production. So, just a quick review of the production cycle. Remember, we start out with the development period, then we move into pre production, production, post production, and then distribution. So, what we're talking about right now is really this shift from production to post production. So, a couple of key details in production to understand is that the main goal in production is to create the assets required for post production. In other words, the focus is on tracking in one of the forms we previously discussed. So, that can include like a live stereo recording, a live to two, where we have multiple microphones that are being mixed live in real time to a stereo mix, a live to multi-track, where we're again recording live with multiple microphones, and those are each stored on a separate multi-track for mix later. A basic session where we track some core components of the recording and then we do overdubs on the rest of it. That could include virtual production, where we're going to use virtual instruments in combination with any of the previous production techniques. And finally, the key last step in production that really is sort of our transition from production to post-production is editing. So in post-production, the three things we're going to focus on a recording production will be editing, mixing, and mastering. And again, you notice that editing is the main process that bridges production and post-production. There's some track editing that's going to occur during sessions in the production stage, and there's other editing that we tend to wait until after the main sessions, and we do them in preparation for the post-production process, specifically in preparation for mixing. So the main editing processes that we're concerned about here include compiling or compositing the final track for each part from multiple takes. This process is sometimes called comping. Some people will say it's short for compositing. Some people will say it's short for compiling. In the end, comping is a pretty common term that we use for this. Again, quite often this might be done during the tracking session where we know which take we liked and we're comping them together into the final track. Especially in the days of tape, that would have been the norm, where our track count was relatively low, and anytime we were going to do another overdub, we generally had to record over what we had previously done. So by the end of an overdub session, we had a comped track. Though periodically, even in those days, we might record multiple takes to different tracks and then bounce them to a single track before the mix stage. However, in digital, there's a lot of processes that come into play with this that allow us to basically put off that editing process until after the session, and then have the luxury of going back to listen to all of the various takes and decide which ones we think are going to be the elements that we want to put into our final track. This will also include beat and pitch correction, track splitting and layout, and finally any cleanup work that needs to be done. So let's break each of these down in a little more detail, and then we'll take some time and watch, we'll pull up some sessions here and I can show you a little bit of what this looks like. So again, for track comping, for each track, the final track must be compiled from all of the various takes. And that requires listening to all of the circled takes. And circled takes, that's a term that comes, I think we borrow that mainly from the film world, where during a session, each time we run a take and the producer or the engineer decides that was a good take, they'll circle it to indicate that that was a keeper take. Again, this is something that really showed up in the modern digital world, where we have the luxury of keeping every single take and deciding in post-production which we're going to use. The important thing, though, is that we're going through musical phrase by musical phrase and sometimes dealing with subphrases, even down to single words or single notes, finding the best examples of the musical performance that we want to craft and interpret the final version of the take that we're going to hear in the mix. And once we get the correct take for each part of the track identified and we've put them all together, we have to edit them together and ensure that there's no audible artifacts from editing. So when we transition from one take to another, we want to make sure that there's no discontinuities that create a click or a pop. We want to make sure that we've done all of our crossfades, fade ins, fade outs, all of those kind of details to ensure that the final track doesn't have any artifacts that would reveal the amount or the type of editing editing that was done in compiling this thing. The goal is that the comped track, when it's played back from start to finish, should sound as if it had happened perfectly live in one take. So the next step we tend to think about is beat and pitch correction. Now, this isn't something that has to happen in every single session or on every single part, but in some cases it's going to be necessary to edit the musical performance to improve the rhythmic timing or the pitch content. And this can happen during production, during tracking sessions, or it can happen in post-production. A lot of this kind of depends on the workflow of the producers and the artists. So for pitch correction, there's a variety of methods to edit the pitch content of a track. The earliest of these was auto-tune. Well, technically, I guess before that, we had the ability to sample and play back samples at different pitches. But in terms of modern pitch correction, auto-tune by Antares was probably the first one that most people would think of. These days, we also have options like Melodyne, which is not an auto-tuner at all. It's a manual tuning method that allows us to go in and do a lot of detailed tuning and detailed editing on a part. A lot of companies now have pitch correction. Slate has just released recently a pitch correction plugin. Waves makes one. There's a variety of options out there. In terms of this video, I'm not going to endorse any one being better than any other. Like most tools, they really rely on the familiarity and fluency of the person using them. In terms of what I will show you, I will likely demonstrate with Melodyne, just because it's the tool that I use the most and I'm most familiar with it. But again, that's not necessarily because Melodyne is better in any objective sense. It's just better for my workflow. The most common place we tend to do pitch correction, of course, is on vocal tracks. And the reason why this happens on vocal tracks more than on any other instrument type is because we push vocalists to deliver incredibly expressive performances. And when we are limited on the amount of time we can spend tracking, getting a great expressive performance with a lot of emotion, a lot of character, and a lot of expressive qualities in terms of the overall dynamics and the shaping, the emotional intensity that we get from that performance. That's the thing that has to happen. I can go back and make subtle pitch correction. So when the performer delivered an incredibly meaningful and expressive performance, they just were a little flat or a little sharp on a few pitches, that's a relatively easy correction. If they get so focused on trying to deliver the exact pitches that they don't deliver an expressive performance, that isn't something that's recoverable because I don't have any tools that I can use to give emotional character to a vocal performance. So I hate to have to choose, but if I had to choose, I would take a really expressive musical performance with some minor pitch problems over a really accurate performance in terms of pitch that has expressive problems or kind of has a lack of affect. But, some other places that we might use this, there are other times that it comes up for other instruments. For example, we might have had a guitar solo and the guitarist was bending notes, maybe using their whammy bar, and pulled the guitar out of tune, and in the next section of the song, the guitar's a little bit off. Or maybe we had a bass player that for whatever reason the intonation was off on their instrument. Hopefully, as you recall from previous classes, that bass guitar should have had an intonation set up that week before the session, but occasionally it happens that we get midway through a track and there's just one note that was a little gamey on the bass or on the guitar. So we can go back in and do some correction on that. The important thing to understand is that in the modern era, we have a much more narrow sense of pitch than would have been considered acceptable in previous eras. When we go back to the 1960s, we find that there's a lot of recordings that really have some pretty seriously out of tune notes. The two that come to mind that are really successful, great songs that everybody has heard a million times, they have literally made millions of dollars for the labels that released them, would be Wouldn't It Be Nice from the Beach Boys. At the very beginning, the harps are ridiculously out of tune. And Ruby Tuesday by the Rolling Stones. There's a flute solo in that is really quite horribly out of tune. And they get away with it. In that era, that sense of what was considered in tune was a bit more broad. In the modern era, especially on on anything that's being backed by a label, if we ever delivered anything with those kind of pitch problems in this day and age, it would get kicked back to us and we'd be expected to retrack it and to correct those problems. So this is one of the things that we have to consider in a modern recording session, is that our pitch center is much more narrow than it was in previous eras. The other part of musical performance that we may do correction on would be what's called beat correction, which is really rhythmic correction. So there's a variety of methods that we can use to do this, where basically we can take and correct the timing of a part. So there's a couple of things that could happen with that. One, we could have had a performer that played along with a click track, but they simply weren't very accurate. And so we need to go back and tighten their performance with the click track. The other times, we may have not used a click track, and there may just be some places where the bass player and the drummer were supposed to hit together, and it was a little loosey-goosey, and we want to go back and tighten up those performances and really get them to a high level of rhythmic coherence between the parts. Again, a lot of different options depending on whether we're talking about a session that was recorded with a click track, a session that was recorded without a click track, and we've added a click track after the fact to be able to do overdubs, or a session that was recorded with a click track and the player simply wasn't as tight with the click track as we might want. But in any case, there's a variety of methods. There's a method where we effectively chop up audio clips and move them around in the timeline. There's another method using a technology called time compression and expansion. In Pro Tools, this is referred to as elastic audio, that allows us to effectively move notes around by doing this time compression and expansion process, which is a way of changing the duration of parts of an audio file without changing the pitch. So, one of the questions that comes up when we think about beat and pitch correction, and this really is a very big question for us, but there's two questions that kind of come to mind. One is, how much can actually be done with this? Like, how much can we get away with? How out of tune could a vocal part be before we wouldn't really be able to tighten it up and tune it? Or how far out of time could a drum performance be before it's really not usable and not recoverable? The other question, and this is often, I think, the bigger one for a lot of us as musicians, is how much should be done? And, is this cheating to do this? Shouldn't we do another take and keep doing takes until we get a perfect performance? Because after all, that's what was done in the past. All of those great recordings that we love from especially the 70s and the 80s, this high period of recording to analog tape, we really are often floored by the tightness of these performances in an era long before people had the ability to go back and edit and clean these things up. Listening to the rhythm section from Fleetwood Mac on the Rumors album and hearing the tightness of Mick Fleetwood with John McVie, the unbelievable precision that those guys are playing with, or maybe the performances on Toto 4. Again, the question is it cheating if we go back and do some editing to get things to sound that tight when maybe the musicians we're recording were incapable of delivering that level of performance? So, in terms of the first question, the simple answer is that the technology today allows engineers to do really almost anything. We really can kind of clean up a pretty disastrously inaccurate performance if needed. But the big thing is it's going to take a significant amount of time. And remember, time is money. So in many cases, there simply isn't the money or room in the budget to allow an engineer to go in and do that kind of work at the level that would be needed. So there are still limits to what we can do. There's a certain point where on a tight budget or on a very quick turnaround, we might simply have to accept that the performances simply can't be improved. So for all of you as performers, the important thing to know is that you want to show up in the studio and you want to go in with the attitude that you're going to deliver the perfect take, the perfect performance. You're going to take the time to rehearse, practice, to prepare, and make sure that you are able to come in and deliver a high quality performance. But If we need to, we can go back and make some subtle corrections. But the less we have to do, the better. The less of that has to be done, the more likely that you, as a professional studio musician, would get called back for more sessions. If you come in and deliver mediocre takes, there's a good chance that there's somebody out there who can come in and do a better job. And since time is money, that means the other person might end up being significantly cheaper for the next production. So we don't want to have to rely on this technology, but we do want to be aware of the fact that it's there. And especially for certain instruments, like I say, the most important one being vocal performances, it really has become something that we rely on to be able to get really high quality performances on a relatively tight time frame. The other issue is that the engineer that we're working with may not have the tools available to do the kind of detailed work that would need to be done. They may not necessarily have the skill or the experience to do it to the level that would need to be done. So, for example, if the pitches are a quarter tone sharp or a quarter tone flat, it's relatively easy to tune those and to do it in a way that doesn't produce a lot of artifacts. If the original pitch was off by a minor third, yeah, even with very good tuning software, when we pull that to the correct pitch, there's a pretty good chance that it out of the box, it's not going to sound great. And we need to go back in and do some editing to really minimize the artifacts that come from that kind of radical pitch correction. If we have to tune more than that, again, it's going to get more and more dicey. Likewise, if we're doing rhythmic editing, there's only so much we can do. And the challenge is when we're editing and doing beat correction, there's a danger that by chopping these things up and moving them around in the timeline that we may do more harm than good, that we may lose some of the subtle feel and groove that was keeping this thing working when when it was originally performed. So we tend to focus on the most offensive problems rather than trying to completely correct a terrible performance. If it's a terrible performance, ideally we would run another take, or we would bring in a different performer if that's our worst case scenario. As far as the cheating idea, I really have no way to answer that one other than to ask, is it cheating to do 85 takes and to comp that together in the best performance possible, the way that would have commonly been done throughout the 1970s and 80s? Right? When we think about the vocal performances on Bohemian Rhapsody, we know that there were many takes done to achieve the immaculate performances that we hear in the final version. And of course, because they were layering so many tracks and they had to do so many takes, we know historically that there was actually concern. They had worn down the tape pretty significantly by the time they were done doing all of those overdubs. So is that cheating, or is that more or less cheating than doing 2 or 3 takes, taking the best elements of them and then doing some pitch correction? In the end, my way of resolving this is to remember that all modern media is constructed. When we watch a movie, that's not what happened in real time. It's a real-time performance that was constructed from a variety of takes done at different times, perhaps at different days, possibly even in different studios and different locations. It's a construction, or a construct rather. So we build these things to create the illusion of a live, real performance. But we're not obligated to work from that. However, again, the more editing we have to do, the more likely it is that we're going to start running into problems where our edits have created more problems than they solved. So we do want to be sensitive to that. And again, the goal should always be to serve the music. So if making a few pitch changes helps me to increase the likelihood that an end listener is going to enjoy the song and have a meaningful emotional response to it, they're going to connect to the lyrics, they're going to connect to the song a little better, I'm perfectly happy to go in and do pitch and rhythm correction. If we've really lost sight of it and we're just arbitrarily editing things, I think at that point the question is, are we perhaps maybe losing some subtle detail? And, I think we talked in class earlier this semester about the example of the Aretha Franklin cover of Adele, Rolling in the Deep, which I think is offensively in tune. We can hear the artifacts of the tuning that was done during the session. It doesn't sound good. And my guess is that Aretha's blue notes, the notes that would have been slightly out of tune, probably sounded pretty hip. She had a long history of singing and delivering great performances. And remember, in a lot of musical styles, those slightly out of tune notes, those blue notes that slide into the gaps in between and then perhaps resolve by finally arriving at a note that's in tune, that can be an incredibly expressive tool. So we don't want to take that off the table. But we do want to pay attention to those places that we feel like that note should be in tune. It would serve the music better if that particular note were in tune, and it's not, so let's tune it. So track splits and layouts. Once I've got my track comped, I've made any pitch and timing edits that need to be made. The next thing that I'm going to start working on are what we call track splits and layouts. Now, the previous two editing steps sometimes happen in production during the recording sessions. Sometimes they happen in post-production. This step is almost always something that we would do in post-production because when we do this next step, it generally is based on the preferences of the mix engineer that's going to be mixing the project. So we talked during production about the key players during the production process, the producer, the first engineer, the second engineer, possibly an assistant engineer. Remember that in the professional world, quite often the project is going to be mixed by a separate person, a professional dedicated mix engineer. And that person, again, is a completely different engineer, separate from the engineers that worked on the project during tracking. So quite commonly, one of the first things they're going to do is either they or their assistant would start setting up the tracks based on the preferred setup of that particular mix engineer. So some of that might mean splitting up a track. Maybe we had a guitar track that was recorded all on one track, but some of it is a clean guitar part, some of it's a distorted guitar part, or maybe some of it's a rhythm guitar part, some of it is a lead guitar part. And for ease of mixing, because the mixer might want to do radically different signal processing on those tracks, or be able to set their levels differently and not have to write a lot of mix automation, they may split that up between different tracks just for ease of operation. Other examples of this might be taking a vocal track and splitting it up between verse and chorus. Again, taking a guitar part and splitting it up between rhythm and lead parts or between clean and dirty parts. Splitting a bass track based on clean versus distortion. All of these would be pretty common track splits that we might do just to ease the process during mixing. And again, a lot of different reasons for that. The other thing we need to think about is the track layout. And this is something that every mix engineer has their preferences for how they lay out their tracks. Many of us who started back in the days of analog tape tend to have a pattern of keeping the highest track number that's in use and the lowest track number in use often would be kick drum for track 1, say, and the bass guitar for track 24 if we were not using SMPTE timecode, track 22 if we were using SMPTE timecode, because in the days of 24-track tape, if we striped SMPTE timecode on track 24, we would tend to leave track 23 blank. Track 22 might be our bass guitar. But a common pattern might be drums, then guitars, then vocals, maybe then bass guitar. Keyboards might be somewhere in the middle. Many mix engineers have a preference for having the tracks that they are going to move the faders on the most in the middle of the console where they want to sit while they're performing the mix. Makes it easier to write automation if we're writing automation on an analog console, or to make manual mix moves if we're performing a mix live on a console that doesn't have automation. So again, these specific preferences tend to be pretty tied to particular mix engineers. So it's not something that we could do during the session. It wouldn't really be valuable until we know who's mixing the project and what their specific preferences are. And again, I've got some notes on here for some of the things we just talked about. A couple other things that come up that I didn't mention a minute ago. The order of the drums. Many of us in the old days were used to having kick drum, again, on track 1, maybe snare drum on track 2, then overheads, then toms, other things in the drum kit. These days, a lot of us have switched over to an overhead perspective first. So my mix preference, actually, most of the time when I'm mixing, I actually have my overheads as my first tracks, and then all my accent mics on the drum kit come after that. I tend to prefer to have drums, bass, guitar, keyboards, vocals in order. I don't feel like I need to have vocals in the middle of my mixing console because I mix on a control surface. So I can put those tracks anywhere. I can bank over to the vocal track and have those available to me right in the sweet spot because I'm not mixing on a large format analog console like the one you saw in 213, the large API Vision. Um, Again, it's just a question of what the mix engineer wants and what's going to facilitate the mix process as much as possible, because the goal is once we get the mixer on the job and they start mixing, they want to be able to get the mix done as quickly and efficiently as possible. So any particular layout and arrangement decisions that we can make on track order that can facilitate that are going to be helpful. So finally, we want to start thinking about track cleanup. And this includes a variety of processes, but the big thing is that we want to make sure that all of our tracks have been evaluated for any kind of problems, that every track we've applied some critical listening to it and ensured that, for example, any unwanted noises in a place where there's musical rests, that we've gone through and cleaned those up. Depending on the context, we may need to go back and cut fill for that. Fill would be an example of, let's say we have a audio track, and because the room had a little bit of background noise in it, maybe there was an HVAC system running, so we can hear a little bit of kind of a in the background. And in a portion where there was supposed to be a musical rest, there was a thud, and we delete that thud. In that moment where we deleted the thud, we might kind of consciously recognize the where that background noise drops out. So as weird as it seems, after we've taken out the thud, there's situations where we will go back and find a clean example of some of that background noise and edit it in, because the lack of that sound dropping out is less distracting than to have the sound drop out. This is a technique we commonly use in film and television when we're editing dialogue, but I find it comes up particularly if I'm working on like live to stereo or live to multi-track, any of those kind of live techniques where there's likely to be a moderate amount of background noise, and taking the background noise out at any given time starts to draw attention to the constructed nature of the recording in a way that might sound a little unnatural. This could also include going through and doing more advanced techniques like noise reduction, hum removal, or any of the visual editing paradigms like Isotope RX that allows us to really go in and really get quite surgical and clean up and take out problematic sounds that have ended up in our audio tracks. Now, how much of this we do, again, is largely a question of, one, how problematic are the sounds, and two, how much time that we have. I can do an amazing amount of cleanup work and make tracks that were recorded in significantly less than ideal environments sound far, far improved. The question is, how much time is it going to take, and is there space in the budget to put in that much time on those kind of ideas? So, as much as possible, just like with pitch and rhythm, we want to try and get things right during the session. The ability to clean these things up after the fact is not an excuse to do sloppy work during tracking. It's a way of overcoming the reality that sometimes on the perfect take, somebody knocked a mic stand over on the other side of the room right during a moment where there was a break in the performance. Things like that we want to go back and clean up. Now, in the days of tape, we would commonly do this with processors called noise gates. However, in this day and age, in the digital age, we have the ability to be far more accurate and do a much better job with this by actually going in and manually editing the tracks. So typically, before the mix process starts, we've comped our tracks, we've done any pitch and beat correction, we've fixed any layout problems to make sure that the mix engineer is going to be happy, and then we've done track cleanup on all of our tracks to make sure that we have great, clean tracks that are ready to mix. Finally, next, we move into the mix process. And mixing is the next major creative step. There are key creative decisions that are still being made during the mix process. And that's going to include configuring the final arrangement of the sound sources on the sound stage. So this is sometimes referred to as stereo imaging. The final arrangement from left to right, and to a certain extent our perception of front to back, what instruments are closer to us and what instruments are farther away, is one of the main things that's going to happen during the mix process. And of course, in certain types of recording, like in a live to stereo, that was determined in the room by where the players were due to the nature of how we recorded it with a main stereo array that just accurately represented the spatial arrangement of the musicians in the room. But in a multi-track recording, we have the option to really rethink these and pretty radically restage things. And of course we do, ideally with a focus on generating the most meaningful arrangement that will help us to best serve the music and the musical message. This mixing also includes applying any signal processing that we need to alter the timbre of the various musical parts to get to the desired sound. So that might include using equalizers and compressors on some tracks. It could include adding various reverbs or delays, echoes to sounds to create a more interesting sound that better serves the music and that better matches the goals of the producer or the performers. And the mix process also includes setting the final musical balance between the various parts. So this tends to be what a lot of us think of when we think of mixing, moving the faders up and down until it sounds good and you get a good musical balance. Finally, one of the last things that we want to think about is applying any additional signal processing to add environmental cues. So these are specific signal processes that are used to create the perception of a room around the sound stage. So this could include delays that are used to create an early reflection field, a sense of the sound arriving after bouncing off of various surfaces in the room shortly after the direct sound arrives. And it could include, and usually does include, adding reverb, which is what happens when those reflections have bounced and off of enough surfaces and there's enough of those reflections that they fuse and we're no longer conscious of the individual echoes. It becomes that recognizable sound that we call reverb. Importantly, this is not the order that any of this stuff happens in. Some mix engineers do certain things first and other things later. Again, this is a lot of personal preference. The order on the screen is actually moderately accurate to what I tend to do as a mixer. But again, every mix engineer is going to find that they have a particular workflow, and as long as it works for them, that's the important thing. After the mix is done, we move into the mastering stage. And mastering is really the final stage of the creative process. It's the last time that we can do anything that is going to meaningfully influence the overall creative quality of the product. But it also is the transition to the more industrial process of producing all the final stuff that's going to be distributed to the end listener and the end user. So it very much is a transition stage. The key things that will happen during mastering: any final adjustments to the spectral balance and the loudness of the entire program of the album. So spectral balance, in simple terms, that just means we do some EQing to make any corrections. The goal here is that when we listen to the mixes in a mastering room, we may find that we have some concern about how well the final mix will translate to other more common listening environments that the end listener may be hearing the recording in. So we try and make corrections to ensure that the lows, mids, and highs are properly balanced in a way that will translate acceptably from a variety of different listening environments. We can never equalize it and make sure that everybody can hear the same thing. In simple truth, somebody listening on a $10,000 set of really hi-fi speakers in a dedicated critical listening room is never going to hear the same thing that someone hears when they play it back on their phone through the speakers built into their phone, or on a crappy set of headphones that have excessively low end. We're never going to be able to create the same experience for all of those people. But the goal is to limit the range in which those things happen so that it is as good as it can be, given the context of the circumstance that the listener is listening on. And the important thing about this, mastering is generally done in a very, very high quality listening environment. In real world terms, it's quite common that a mastering engineer would, in fact, be listening on a set of speakers that maybe do run 10, 15, 20, 30, $40,000. They could be using super high quality hi-fi amplifiers that could be in the thousands of dollars range. Their digital to analog conversion could be what we call mastering grade, which again could get into the thousands of dollars. Ideally, a mastering studio is a place that presents a higher quality listening environment than anyone else in the world will ever hear. The idea being that if there's a problem on the recording, we want to hear it and identify it during mastering. We don't want somebody listening and trying to master an album in an environment that doesn't have sufficient low end, and then an end user has a better stereo system than the mastering engineer did, and they end up hearing a lot of problems that no one heard during mastering. Again, the goal is that during mastering, we should be listening in the most pristine of listening environments, which allows us to be confident that any problems in the recording, in the mix, have been addressed, have been resolved appropriately, and that we've created a very consistent listening experience for the end listener. I mentioned also that we make final corrections to loudness. One of the challenges that we have is that in a mixing studio, in a control room where we're doing mixing, this is generally going to be a purpose-designed control room. These are quite quiet compared to real-world circumstances, which means maybe during the mixing process, we had a greater range of dynamics than an end listener could really get away with. So maybe the quietest parts of the song, we let them get really quiet. We wanted it to be a really dramatic moment where maybe in the middle section of a song, we wanted it to feel like things had really pulled in and gotten very intimate. And then in the next section of the song, it jumps up by 6, 8, 10 dB. The problem with that is that in the classic scenario we might think of is somebody driving in a car on the highway, where the background noise from driving the car in the highway would obscure those quiet sections. And the most frustrating scenario that many of us have had, maybe listening to classical music in a car, is that we get into a quiet passage, we can't hear it, so we turn the volume up quite a bit until we can hear it, and then we get to a really loud section and it blasts your ears out and maybe damages your speakers. So in mastering, we try and rein in the dynamic range to a more usable, listener-friendly dynamic range that still presents the sense that there was a change in performance intensity, that the performance went from being really loud to really quiet. But maybe the actual final loudness doesn't change as much as would have actually been indicated by the timbral differences we hear in the performance intensities. And again, this is one of the key things that we think about doing. As a bit of a sidebar, the history of mastering as we know it, really was not a thing until the end of the 1940s. And the reason for that was because prior to that, the master was made at the same time that the recording session was being run. In the days of recording directly to shellac or lacquer, or in the earlier area, recording to wax, during a recording session, they were actually cutting the lacquer master that would then be used to stamp out all of the various vinyl pressings. So one of the things that changed with the tape era was that during a recording session, what was being recorded to was tape. But that was well before the era where consumers would have been buying tape as a final product. They would have been buying albums. So an album a song that was recorded to tape then at some point had to be transferred and used to cut a lacquer master. And the person who did that transfer was called a mastering engineer. The key thing here is that tape had a very different dynamic range and a very different frequency response than lacquer or the vinyl that was pressed for the final record. So in the end, one of the key things that was done is to try and make changes to accommodate that, so that when people listened in the final target format, in the format of the final vinyl pressing, that they heard something close to what the people had heard when they made their decisions on the final mix that was done to tape. And so the other key thing that needs to be done, as I've been getting at here, is to make any required format changes. Again, in the early era, that would have been going from tape to a lacquer master, which would have been used as part of the manufacturing process to stamp out vinyl records. Um, in the next era, that might have been going from tape to digital to use to create a glass master for CD replication. These days, the key thing we tend to think about in format changes would be converting sample rates if the recording sessions were done at anything other than 44.1 kilohertz, and converting bit depth. In most cases, we tend to do our professional work these days at 24-bit, but consumer level audio is 16-bit. So the mastering engineer is the person who does the final transition, the final conversions of sampling rate, as well as converting the bit depth to the final target format. Often, either the mastering engineer or their assistant will handle authoring any digital media. So in this day and age, if we are still pressing CDs, which is somewhat common these days, we have two ways of making CDs. We can make CDs through a process called replication, which is the traditional process. This uses a process that creates what's called a glass master, which is then used to replicate a large number of CDs. In colloquial terms, people often call these real CDs. The other process is called duplication, and this simply means that we run off a bunch of recordable CDs, a bunch of CDRs. And the process is a little different. However, for the last 20 years or so, we've used a common authoring process. We create what's called a DDP file, a disk data protocol file, that's uploaded to the manufacturer. And they use that to either manufacture the glass master or to make the initial CD that all the other CDs are going to be duplicated from, or the data that the CD writers are using to duplicate multiple CDs at the same time. So again, a lot of key things that happen during mastering, some of which are borderline creative. Spacing the album, determining track order and getting the what we call gapping, the space between the tracks on an album, all of those kind of things set, making sure that the final product flows and feels really great musically, that what we call the program dynamic contour feels good, the musical balance from one song to the next, from the, as the album progresses, do the loud songs feel appropriately loud, do the quiet songs feel appropriately quiet, all while maintaining a consistent listening experience for the listener throughout the album. But we also have these tasks that are really, like I say, more technical in orientation, and really part of the industrial process of simply getting everything ready so that we can do our final distribution to clients. So just to give you a couple of workflows for how some of these things might work out in terms of sample rate and bit depth. It would be fairly common that during production we might record everything at 48 kilohertz at 24-bit. During mixing, the tracks are mixed in their original format, which again is 48 kilohertz 24-bit, so the output of the mix, the final mix, is 4824. That 4824-bit file is then used for mastering. And that 4824, the highest quality that we would have of this product, could be used to cut the lacquer master if the artist or the record label wants to cut or wants to press vinyl. The 4824 version would also be kept and used for synchronization to video. A video uses 48 kilohertz, so we would keep it in the original 48 kilohertz format for syncing with a music video or for placement in TV shows or films, a way that an artist might try and commodify and make some money off of the recording. But they would also do sample rate conversion to 44.1 kilohertz and bit depth conversion to 16-bit for use in digital distribution. So if the artist or the label is going to use an aggregator like CD Baby or DistroKid, what they accept is 44.116. So the files that we provide to them need to be in that format. And obviously we want the mastering engineer to make those conversions and to be able to do quality control listening to ensure that after that conversion, everything sounds as it should, that conversion process happened as transparently as possible. We may also use that 44.116 or 44.1 kilohertz and 16-bit file to author the DDP file that would be used for replication or duplicating a CD. And again, in this day and age, that process is often going to be done by the same places that we might use to upload to streaming services. So once again, CD Baby and TuneCore are two of the biggest companies that artists and DIY and independent artists and smaller record labels use to replicate and duplicate CDs, as well as getting your stuff on the streaming services like Tidal, Spotify, Pandora, Apple Music, Amazon, all of the options that are out there. Another example, thinking about signal level. We talked earlier this semester about how in the professional world, when working at 24-bit, we tend to have a reference level that leaves a significant amount of headroom. So during tracking, the signal level might have been tracked in an environment where a nominal analog signal level of 0 VU equals plus 4 dBu analog signal level, which equates to negative 20 dB full scale in digital. We've left 20 dB of headroom. Now, that's great for us when we're working in the production process because we have plenty of headroom and we have a huge dynamic range working at 24-bit. Our dynamic range per track is in the 144 decibel range theoretically. Practically speaking, it really ends up in the 141 dB range. So we've got a huge dynamic range, even leaving 20 dB of headroom at the top end. During the mixing process, that same reference level might be maintained, and the final mix might come out with a reference level of negative 20 dB full scale. However, that mix is going to sound much too quiet compared to other commercial releases. So during the mastering process, that could be brought up to a much louder signal level, perhaps maybe at negative 20 dB full scale, or negative 12 dB full scale rather, for certain musical genres. For other musical genres, it might be pushed louder than that. We may end up with a recording where the nominal signal level is sitting up around negative 10 dB full scale or negative 8 dB full scale. And those changes would be made during mastering. Again, there's no reason for us to be chasing loudness during the production and the mixing process when we're working at 24-bit because of the huge dynamic range afforded to us in a 24-bit environment. So that gives you an overview of the end of the production process and the post-production process that we're going to be moving into and talking about for the next couple of weeks of the class. So I hope this is helpful. I again apologize for having to miss class yesterday. I hope this video at least gives you some material to get up to speed. We'll jump back in class next week. Thanks for watching.